New York City, March 25, 1911. The sun was setting over Manhattan's skyline, painting the brick walls of Greenwich Village in gold. Inside the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, hundreds of young women bent over sewing machines, stitching silk blouses for $1 a day. They were daughters of immigrants, dreamers of a better life, speaking Yiddish, Italian, and hope. The clock neared quitting time. A few laughed softly, imagining the weekend. None of them knew that the air already smelled faintly of smoke. It began as a flicker, a whisper of fire feeding on scraps of cloth beneath a cutting table. Within seconds, it grew into a storm. The 8th floor ignited like paper, flames racing across oil-soaked fabrics and wooden beams. Shouts turned to screams as smoke filled the stairwell. Some rushed to the elevators. Others found the doors bolted shut. Locked, to keep them from taking breaks, to keep them working faster. Outside, passers-by stopped in horror as the first bodies began to fall. The fire ladders reached only the 6th floor, the rest was left to fate. In less than 20 minutes, 146 lives were gone, their dreams turned to ash, their cries carried by the wind over Washington Square. This is not merely a story of a factory fire. It's a confession written in smoke, a moment when industry's pride collided with human fragility. The Triangle Fire exposed the price of greed, the silence of safety laws, and the voices of those trapped behind locked doors. Their story would ignite a movement, forcing a nation to ask the question it had long avoided: how much is a worker's life truly worth? Her name was Kate Alterman, a 17-year-old immigrant from Poland who had come to America chasing a dream of freedom and dignity. On that March afternoon, she stood near her sewing machine on the 9th floor of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, surrounded by laughter, the hum of machinery, and the smell of freshly pressed silk. When the first shouts of fire erupted, she thought it was another cruel joke, until the smoke poured from the elevator shaft and the world turned to chaos. They were all screaming, she would later testify, her voice shaking before a grand jury. The elevators stopped, and I saw my friends burn right before me. Those few words, so simple, so unbearable, pierced through the courtroom silence. They carried the weight of 146 souls who would never speak again. Kate's memory of that day became a window into the horror hidden behind factory walls. She recalled the girls running to locked doors, banging until their hands bled. She remembered the acrid smoke crawling under tables, the desperate rush toward windows as flames devoured the room. Some tried to use fabric bolts as ropes, but the silk caught fire in midair. Others held hands and jumped together, their final act of courage. Outside, the streets filled with witnesses frozen in disbelief. One police officer dropped his hat and crossed himself as body after body struck the pavement. Reporters described the sound not as a crash, but a dull thud, the sound of dreams ending. When investigators asked Kate why she had survived, she said she followed a man who smashed a pane of glass and leapt toward a fire escape. The metal twisted under their weight, but she climbed, half blind, until she reached the roof. From there, she looked down and saw smoke curling like a serpent through the windows where her friends had been minutes before. Her testimony became more than evidence. It became conscience. Newspapers quoted her words across America, forcing a nation to look at what it had ignored, that progress without protection was nothing but cruelty in disguise. The Triangle Fire wasn't only a blaze in a building, it was the burning of an illusion, the belief that hard work alone could guarantee safety and fairness. In every sentence Kate spoke, there was guilt for surviving, sorrow for those who didn't, and quiet fury for those who had locked the doors. Her eyes, witnesses said, never lost the reflection of that fire. Through her, history found its voice, not from politicians or owners, but from a young immigrant girl who saw the cost of ambition written in flame. Her trembling words still echo through time, a reminder that progress built on silence will always end in smoke. The Triangle Waste Company occupied the top 3 floors of the 10-story Asch Building, a steel-frame structure on the corner of Green Street and Washington Place in Lower Manhattan. It was considered fireproof, a marvel of modern architecture. Sunlight poured through wide windows, and electric lights hummed overhead. On paper, it was progress. But behind the walls, the air was thick with lint, the floors cluttered with scraps, and the girls who labored there were treated as replaceable parts in a machine that never stopped. Each morning, the women arrived carrying lunch wrapped in newspaper, their hair tucked under scarves, their fingers already sore from the day before. Many were teenagers, barely 16. They worked 11 hours a day, 6 days a week, for wages that barely paid for a room in the Lower East Side. The owners, Max Blank and Isaac Harris, were called the Shirtwaist Kings, proud symbols of immigrant success. Yet their empire was built on speed and obedience. Time was money, and hesitation was punished. That Saturday, March 25, 1911, was supposed to be light work, half a day before the Sabbath. The mood in the factory was easy, even cheerful. Spring sunlight spilled across the cutting tables where cotton scraps lay in soft piles. A foreman joked with a group of girls near the freight elevator. A few hummed old songs from Naples and Odessa. It was 4:40 in the afternoon. In 20 minutes, they would be free. Then, somewhere on the 8th floor, someone flicked a cigarette or dropped a match. No one noticed at first. A faint thread of smoke rose between the tables, blending with the dust and chatter. Then came the first gasp, the unmistakable smell of burning cloth. Flames raced through the rows of fabric, feeding on oil, lint, and air. The fire spread like wind through dry leaves. The 8th floor erupted. A cutter named Louis Brown shouted for water, but there were no sprinklers, no hoses, no alarm system. Buckets of water sat empty or misplaced. The fire leapt from table to table, catching hair, sleeves, and curtains. The heat built so fast that the air itself seemed to ignite. Workers rushed toward the elevator, but within seconds, the shaft filled with smoke. The operator, a man named Joseph Zito, could see nothing, yet he stayed. Zito made trip after trip, guiding terrified girls into the car, lowering them through clouds of smoke to the street below. Each time he returned, more bodies pressed against the doors. By his last trip, the heat had bent the metal frame, and the cables began to melt. When the elevator finally stopped for good, the screams of those left behind echoed down the shaft. On the 9th floor, no one knew what had happened below. The telephone connecting the floors went unanswered. When the fire burst through the windows, panic exploded. The young women rushed toward the Washington Place stairway, the only exit they knew, but it was locked. The company had kept it bolted to prevent theft and unauthorized breaks. Someone shouted for the key, but the foreman who had it was already dead. Trapped, the workers crowded near the windows. Some tried to climb down the narrow fire escape on the exterior of the building. It had been cheaply built and barely secured to the wall. Under the weight of dozens of bodies, it twisted, then tore free, crashing down into the courtyard below. Inside, smoke turned day into night. Girls covered their faces with rags and skirts. A few climbed onto the cutting tables, hoping the air above the flames would be cleaner. Flames rolled across the ceiling, crackling like thunder. The floorboards glowed red beneath their shoes. Down on the street, pedestrians heard the shouts before they saw the fire. Within minutes, crowds gathered, pointing upward at the plumes of black smoke curling from the top floors. When the first body fell, there was silence, the kind of silence that only comes from disbelief. Then another fell. And another. Witnesses described it as a rain of burning fabric and human forms. A police officer ran into the building but was forced back by the smoke. Firemen arrived quickly, but their ladders reached only the 6th floor, 4 floors too short. They stretched nets below the windows, hoping to catch those who jumped, but the force of the impact tore the nets apart. Horses screamed, engines roared, and sirens wailed through the narrow streets, but the fire moved faster than help could reach. On the 9th floor, a man named Samuel Bernstein fought to keep order. He smashed windows with his bare hands, shouting for the women to stay calm. He led a few toward the roof, pushing them upward through a small iron door. Another worker, a bookkeeper named Isaac, stayed behind, trying to guide others to the elevator shaft. When they realized the car was no longer coming, they began climbing down the cables, only to lose their grip and vanish into the dark. A witness on the roof of a nearby building later said he saw girls appear one after another at the windows, some kneeling, some holding hands, some crossing themselves, before leaping into the air. One girl clutched a bundle to her chest as she jumped. When rescuers reached her body later, they found it was a sewing machine. Within 18 minutes, the fire had done its work. Flames roared through the top floors, shattered glass rained onto the street, and the building's interior turned to a furnace. At 5 p.m., the last walls of the 9th floor collapsed inward, and a column of smoke rose into the evening sky. Firefighters finally reached the roof through adjoining buildings and began hosing down the embers. Inside, the heat was so intense they had to take turns entering, crawling over piles of ash and twisted metal. The staircases were gone. The wooden floors had burned through. What remained were heaps of charred fabric and the black outlines of bodies frozen in their final moments, some still clutching each other, others curled near the locked door. Outside, New York stood still. Thousands gathered, blocking the streets, their faces lit by the orange glow. Reporters, policemen, and ordinary citizens formed silent lines as the bodies were laid on the sidewalk. The city morgue overflowed. Churches opened their doors for the dead. For 2 days, wagons carried the victims, one after another, to temporary holding sites. Among them were sisters, cousins, mothers, and daughters, families destroyed in minutes. Some could only be identified by jewelry or a single shoe. Others remained unknown, buried under the name Unidentified Woman. In the days that followed, the newspapers filled with headlines, 146 dead in factory fire. Photographs of the burnt-out building shocked the nation. People who had never stepped inside a factory now saw what industrial progress looked like when profit outran humanity. Crowds came to stare at the Asch Building, its walls still standing like a ghost of modern ambition. When the smoke cleared, the questions began. Why were the doors locked? Why were there no fire drills, no alarms, no sprinklers? How could a building called fireproof become a tomb for almost 200 workers? The owners, Blank and Harris, survived by escaping to the roof. They watched their factory burn from above as the city screamed below. Within weeks, they faced charges of manslaughter, but the legal system of 1911 was not built to hold men like them accountable. Their lawyers argued that no one could prove they had personally locked the doors. The jury, swayed by technicalities, acquitted them. Still, the public outrage was unstoppable. The funeral procession for the victims stretched for blocks, a river of black umbrellas moving slowly through the rain. More than 100,000 people stood in silence as the coffins passed. Women wept openly. Men clenched their hats against their chests. For once, New York's rich and poor shared the same street, united by grief and fury. At the inquest, witnesses like Kate Alterman and Joseph Zito told their stories again and again. Lawmakers listened, and the city began to change. The fire had revealed not just the weakness of buildings but the weakness of conscience. From the ashes of the Triangle Factory rose a new movement, unions demanding safety, reformers pushing for laws to protect workers, and journalists determined to expose injustice. The event became the catalyst for change, the line between the old industrial world and a new one shaped by accountability. But in March 1911, as the smoke drifted over Manhattan and the smell of burned fabric lingered for days, none of that was yet known. There was only silence, the stunned realization that the city which had promised opportunity had instead delivered death. And above it all, the Asch Building still stood, its brick facade unscarred, its windows empty, its name now etched in memory as the place where modern America was forced to look at itself and reckon with the true cost of progress. Before it was a tragedy, it was a workplace, filled with laughter, fatigue, and the quiet rhythm of survival. Each of those who died at the Triangle Factory had a story, a reason to endure the endless hours, and a fragile dream carried from another shore. They were not statistics. They were hearts beating inside a machine that never stopped turning. Clara was 19, her dark hair always tied in a neat braid beneath her scarf. Every week, she sent half her pay to Naples, where her brothers still went to school. She wanted them to become men of letters, free from the noise and heat of the factory life she knew too well. She often hummed Italian lullabies while stitching the delicate shirtwaists that would one day hang in the wardrobes of women who never wondered where they came from. Beside her sat Esther, a quiet Jewish girl from Odessa who had fled the pogroms with her mother. She kept a folded piece of lace in her apron pocket, part of the wedding dress she was saving to finish. She spoke little English, but her smile bridged the silence between languages. Every Friday, she dreamed of lighting Sabbath candles in her own home, her hands no longer blistered from thread and flame. There was also Jacob, a cutter on the 8th floor, who could move a pair of shears faster than anyone in the shop. He joked that one day he'd open his own tailor shop downtown. "You'll all work for me," he'd laugh. The girls adored him for his kindness. He often slipped coins into their lunch pails when pay was short. His body was found near the locked door. And then there were the owners, Max Blank and Isaac Harris. They too were immigrants, once poor men chasing the same dream as the workers they employed. They had climbed from rags to riches, driven by hunger and fear of failure. In their minds, discipline meant survival. They believed the locked doors prevented theft, that strict rules maintained efficiency. What they never saw was how those same locks turned the factory into a coffin. In the Triangle Factory, humanity existed in fragments: laughter during a stolen break, a slice of bread shared at noon, a letter tucked under a sewing machine from a mother far away. The girls pinned photographs of loved ones to the wooden posts beside their stations. They celebrated birthdays quietly, afraid of being scolded for losing time. Each stitch they made was a piece of their story, woven into garments they would never afford to wear. When the fire came, the world saw only bodies and ashes. Newspapers printed numbers, not names. But behind every number was a life interrupted mid-sentence, a promise never kept, a letter never sent, a song silenced. The fire did not just destroy a building, it stripped the veil from an illusion that progress could exist without compassion. The workers of Triangle were not anonymous laborious, they were the pulse of a nation being built, and in their deaths, they forced America to see its reflection, a country growing rich on the backs of the invisible. Panic has its own sound, a blend of screams, breaking glass, and the roar of something alive devouring everything in its path. On the afternoon of March 25, 1911, that sound echoed through the heart of Manhattan as the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory became an inferno suspended in the sky. From the street below, people began to notice the smoke curling from the upper windows of the Asch Building. At first, they thought it was a chimney fire, but within seconds, flames burst through the glass like tongues of orange lightning. Someone screamed, "They're trapped up there," and a crowd began to form. Men threw their hats to the ground, women covered their mouths in horror, and the smell of burning cloth rolled down Washington Place. Fire engines thundered through the narrow streets, horses snorting, bells clanging. The firefighters jumped from their wagons and raised their ladders with practiced precision, but when they reached full height, the realization struck: the tallest ladder could only reach the 6th floor. The women were trapped on the 8th, 9th, and 10th. The first stream of water hissed as it hit the blazing walls. The pressure was too weak, the heat too strong. Steam clouded the air, hiding the faces in the windows. The crowd could hear the cries but could do nothing. Every minute stretched into eternity. Upstairs, Foreman Sam Bernstein had turned into a man possessed by courage. His hands were blooded from smashing window panes, trying to create a way out. He shouted for the others to climb, to stay close to the windows for air, to keep moving. The smoke was so thick it burned the lungs before it filled them. Some girls soaked their skirts in water and pressed them to their faces. Others prayed in Yiddish, Italian, or silence. The fire had begun only 10 minutes earlier, but already it ruled everything. The floorboards groaned under the heat, and the air shimmered like a mirage. The iron beams that had once promised safety were glowing red, bending like wax. Down below, Fire Chief Edward Croker shouted orders, his voice swallowed by the noise. "Bring the life nets," he cried. His men spread them open, holding tight as the first body fell, a young woman with her dress on fire. The impact ripped the net apart. The firefighters stared in disbelief. It wasn't a rescue, it was a death watch. Then the jumps began. One after another, the girls appeared in the windows, silhouetted against the flames. Some hesitated, clutching the window frames. Others leaped without looking. One man held a woman's hand as they jumped together. A mother tossed down her shawl, as if it could save her daughter. The crowd screamed with every fall, unable to look away. Reporters later described it as a rain of bodies. Some landed on the fire hoses, snapping them in two. Others fell onto the pavement with sickening finality. A horse bolted, throwing its driver to the ground. Policemen tried to hold the crowd back, but many fainted where they stood. Inside the building, the air was unbreathable. The stairwell had collapsed, sealing off escape. Sam Bernstein tried to lead a group toward the roof, but the door was jammed by heat. They pounded on it with a metal bar until it gave way. A handful of girls escaped that way, climbing into the open air, their faces blackened with soot. They watched helplessly as their friends below disappeared into the smoke. The elevator operator, Joseph Zito, made his last ascent, coughing blood, barely conscious. When he reached the 9th floor, the doors jammed half open. Girls clawed at the opening, begging to be taken. "Only 12, he shouted, but dozens clung to the car, screaming his name. As he lowered it for the last time, the cables above melted, and the elevator crashed into darkness. The fire escape, that fragile spine of iron, finally broke free from the wall and twisted downward, sending 20 girls tumbling into the courtyard. The noise of it snapping echoed like a cannon shot. For a brief moment, there was nothing but the roar of the fire and the sound of wind rushing through broken glass. By 4:45 p.m., less than 20 minutes after it began, the factory was a furnace. Flames leapt out of the windows like living things, reaching toward the sky. The heat drove even the firefighters backward. The hoses sputtered, hissing in defeat. The clock inside the Asch Building had melted into a warped circle of brass. The sewing machines stood in silent rows, surrounded by ash. The same tables that had once supported the delicate fabrics of shirtwaists now held only the remains of burned tools and twisted frames. On the street, hundreds of New Yorkers watched in helpless disbelief. One man tried to climb a lamppost to reach a window, but the flames forced him down. Another threw a ladder from a nearby building, but it fell short by 2 floors. The fire was too high, too fast, too cruel. And then, suddenly, silence. The last window shattered, the last scream faded, and the roaring gave way to the crackle of dying embers. Smoke curled upward in slow, ghostly shapes. People whispered prayers, others simply stood, unable to move. When the final flames died, the city's heartbeats seemed to stop with them. The fire had taken everything: laughter, music, ambition, life, and left behind only stillness. It was 4:45 p.m. The sun was setting over New York, but its light could not touch the blackened stone of the Asch Building. The crowd remained frozen, staring at the smoke drifting above the skyline, a smoke that carried not just ashes, but shame. The tension broke not with sound, but with absence, the unbearable quiet that follows catastrophe. And in that silence, New York began to understand what it had witnessed: not just a fire, but a reckoning. By nightfall, New York City had fallen under an eerie hush. The fire that had begun as a spark in a pile of cotton scraps had consumed nearly everything in its reach, and now, the Asch Building stood silent, its windows blackened and hollow like the eyes of a ghost. The streets below were slick with water and ash, littered with broken glass and the twisted remnants of sewing machines. Firefighters moved slowly through the ruins, their faces grey with exhaustion and grief. Every so often, one would stop, kneel, and lift something small: a scorched comb, a melted thimble, or a charred shoe no bigger than a child's hand. Each discovery was a story reclaimed from the ashes. The morgue could not hold them all. By the time the first wagons arrived, the building on Charities Pier was already overflowing. Workers lined the corridors with wooden boards and laid the bodies in rows, tagging each one with a number. The smell of smoke still clung to their burned clothing. Families began to arrive before dawn, faces pale, clutching photographs, ribbons, or scraps of fabric, anything that might help them recognize their loved ones. Some fainted when they saw what remained. Others stood in stunned silence, whispering names through trembling lips. One mother collapsed after identifying her 2 daughters lying side by side, their hands still clasped together. Reporters gathered outside the morgue, scribbling notes by the light of gas lamps. Their headlines the next morning were filled with horror and disbelief. 146 dead in factory fire, read the New York Times. Beneath it, smaller lines listed the names of the identified and the unknown. Other papers published photographs, not of the dead, but of what remained inside the factory: rows of blackened machines, melted scissors, piles of twisted needles. For the first time, the public saw the cost of cheap clothing written in soot. The city's outrage erupted like the fire itself. Crowds gathered outside the ruins, laying flowers on the sidewalk. Priests prayed for the dead, labor leaders shouted for justice. On April 5, 1911, less than 2 weeks after the fire, New York witnessed one of the largest funeral processions in its history. Beneath a low gray sky, tens of thousands marched down Fifth Avenue. The wind carried the sound of drums and hymns through the city's canyons of stone. Some carried banners written in English, others in Italian or Yiddish, We mourn our sisters. We demand justice. In that crowd walked not only workers, but teachers, mothers, and shopkeepers, all united by a shared fury. For once, the invisible poor were visible, their grief undeniable. The fire had turned their silence into a movement. The investigation began almost immediately. Fire inspectors, lawyers, and city officials scoured the building, taking notes on what could have been prevented. The evidence was overwhelming. The exit doors had been locked during working hours. There were no sprinklers, no alarms, and no fire drills. The so-called fireproof building had no real protection for the people inside it. When questioned, the owners, Max Blank and Isaac Harris, defended themselves with the cold confidence of men who believed they had done nothing wrong. We followed the standard practice of the industry, they said, repeating it as if it were a prayer that could absolve them. Their lawyers argued that no law explicitly forbade locking doors during work hours, that the tragedy was an accident of circumstance, not of conscience. The trial began in December 1911 and drew enormous attention. The courtroom was packed every day, with grieving families, labor activists, journalists, and curious citizens. The prosecutor presented evidence of deliberate negligence, testimonies from survivors, photographs of the burnt-out floors, and reports proving that the doors had indeed been locked from the outside. The defense countered with technicalities, insisting that the owners could not be personally blamed unless it was proven beyond doubt that they had turned the key. When the verdict came, the room fell silent. Not guilty. Blank and Harris were free to go. They left the courthouse under police escort as a mob gathered outside, hurling curses and spitting on the ground. Justice had failed, and the city knew it. Yet the story did not end there. The outrage only deepened. Newspaper editorials condemned the verdict as a crime greater than the fire itself. Meetings were held across the city, calling for reforms. Women's groups, immigrant associations, and labor unions joined hands in anger. They demanded laws that would prevent such horror from ever happening again. The fire had done what decades of organizing could not. It united voices that had long been ignored. Frances Perkins, a young social worker who had witnessed the fire from the street below, later said, "The New Deal began on March 25, 1911. To her and many others, that day marked a moral awakening. Within a year, New York passed over 30 new labor laws. Factories were required to install sprinklers, conduct fire drills, and keep doors unlocked during working hours. The state created safety commissions, empowered inspectors, and held owners accountable for the lives of their workers. But for the families, reform brought little comfort. No law could return their daughters or sisters. The ashes of the Triangle fire lingered not just in memory but in the conscience of a nation. The Asch Building, renamed the Brown Building years later, still stood, its walls intact, its exterior unscarred. Students would one day attend classes there, unaware that beneath their feet lay the ground where an entire generation's worth of dreams had turned to dust. The fire exposed more than negligence. It revealed the moral fault line of the American dream. Progress without compassion had led to ruin. Profit without responsibility had cost lives. And though the owners were acquitted, the true verdict had already been delivered, not in a courtroom, but in the collective conscience of a grieving city. From that day forward, the smoke of the Triangle factory became more than a memory. It became a warning, one written in the language of fire, one that demanded to be remembered. When the flames of the Triangle factory finally died, something else ignited, a reckoning. The fire had taken 146 lives, but its aftermath gave birth to a movement that would reshape American labor forever. New York, once the proud emblem of progress, awoke to a haunting truth. The prosperity of its skyscrapers was built on human suffering. In that realization lay the beginning of reform. In the months that followed, grief transformed into outrage and outrage into action. The streets that had echoed with funeral marches now filled with rallies and speeches. Workers demanded justice not just for the dead, but for the living, for those who still labored in buildings where safety was considered optional. The Triangle fire had burned away the illusion that such tragedies were accidents. It revealed them as inevitable results of neglect and greed. One of the witnesses that day was Frances Perkins, a young social worker standing among the horrified crowd below the Asch Building. She saw women leap from the 9th floor, dresses aflame, and felt her faith in the system collapse. Years later, she would recall that afternoon as the day the New Deal began. The fire had seared itself into her conscience. It was the moment she vowed to dedicate her life to protecting the powerless. 2 decades later, she would become the first female Secretary of Labor under Franklin D. Roosevelt, and the architect of many reforms that shaped modern labor rights. From those ashes rose the first real fire safety codes. New York enacted over 30 new laws within 3 years: mandatory sprinklers in high-rise buildings, fire drills for factory workers, unlocked exit doors during working hours, and strict limits on crowding and flammable materials. Inspections became law, not favor. What had once been dismissed as the cost of doing business was now recognized as the cost of human life. But it wasn't only buildings that changed, it was people. Unions gained strength, especially the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, which grew from the grief of that day. Women who had once feared retaliation for speaking out found their voices. They organized, marched, and stood before lawmakers demanding protections once thought impossible. The tragedy had turned victims into symbols and silence into defiance. Still, progress carried a shadow. For the families of the victims, reform came too late. Mothers continued to visit the graves of their daughters, laying flowers beside the numbered stones of the unidentified. The fire may have sparked national change, but the loss remained personal, intimate, and endless. For every law passed, there was a face remembered: Clara, Esther, Jacob, names that refused to fade. The locked doors of the Triangle Factory became more than a historical fact, they became a moral warning. They stood as symbols of what happens when ambition blinds humanity, when safety is traded for profit, when conscience is locked out as tightly as those workers had been. In the end, the tragedy's legacy was not only in the laws it inspired but in the conscience it awakened. America could no longer look away. The fire had burned away indifference, leaving behind the one thing stronger than flame: responsibility. Over a century later, the Asch Building still stands in the heart of Manhattan. Its walls are clean, its windows bright, its corridors filled with the chatter of students rushing to classes. Today it is known as the Brown Building, part of New York University, a place of learning built upon the site of suffering. Most who pass through its doors have no idea that the very floors beneath their feet once burned like the gates of hell. Yet for those who remember, the silence inside those halls carries an echo: the whisper of sewing machines, the laughter of young women, and the cries that history refuses to forget. Time has polished the bricks, but it has not erased the questions. Historians still argue about who bears the true responsibility. Was it corporate greed, owners who valued profit over life? Was it the complacency of city inspectors who ignored warnings? Or was it something deeper, the blind faith of a nation intoxicated by progress, willing to overlook suffering in its race toward modernity? The Triangle Fire remains a mirror that reflects not just the sins of 2 men, but the flaws of an entire system that confused efficiency with humanity. Each March, the bells of New York toll 146 times, once for every life lost in that smoke-filled factory. The ceremony lasts only a few minutes, yet the sound carries the weight of generations. Descendants of the victims gather, along with students, activists, and labor leaders, standing beneath the same sky that once glowed orange with flame. The names are read aloud: Clara, Esther, Jacob, Rose, and for a moment, the city stands still. But remembrance is not the same as resolution. More than 100 years later, sweatshops still exist in other corners of the world, where workers sew in cramped rooms under the same false promises of safety and opportunity. The Triangle Fire may have transformed New York, but the conditions it exposed were never fully extinguished. Every time a factory collapses or a worker dies locked behind a gate, the story repeats itself, another reminder that progress without conscience is only history rewritten in ash. The Asch Building has become both monument and warning. Students write essays in its classrooms. Professors lecture on ethics just steps above where lives were lost. On the outside, bronze plaques honor the dead. Inside, the air feels ordinary, yet beneath the hum of modern life lies a pulse, faint but persistent. The building breathes memory. The Triangle Fire was never just a tragedy, it was a revelation. It forced America to look at the price it was willing to pay for progress, to see that ambition without compassion burns everything in its path. It changed laws, yes, but it also changed conscience. The victims did not die in vain, they became the architects of reform, their absence shaping a better world than the one that betrayed them. And yet, some say that when sirens echo through New York on quiet spring evenings, a cold wind still rushes down Washington Place. It carries the faint scent of smoke, the rhythm of footsteps running, the ghostly hum of sewing machines. It is as if the city itself remembers, not out of fear, but out of obligation. For as long as that wind blows, the story of the Triangle Fire will never truly fade.